Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Ches Amud Beis 8b of Maseches Megillah, and we're starting from the Mishnah slightly down the page, 13 lines I think, and the Mishnah is continuing the 8b-9a Mishnayos, where we compare two things and say they're the same except for the following difference. And this Mishnah is going to be talking about people with tzaras. So there's two types, there are many types of tzaras, but there's two possible stages one might be in. One is if a person finds some kind of, again, tzaras is like leprosy, they find some skin lesion, and they summon the Kohen. The Kohen is the one to check and identify it and declare it tzaras. So if he checks it and it's not tzaras, he says, have a nice day. But if he can affirm it's affirmative tzaras, so then the person gets sent out of the camp or the city and goes through the process of a person who has affirmative tzaras. That's what we are going to call in this Mishnah a mitzora muchlat, a definite mitzora. That's one type of a mitzora, someone who has tzaras. A definite mitzora is a mitzora muchlat. And then there's someone called a mitzora muskar, a quarantine mitzora. That means the Kohen came and he checked, and it wasn't definitive tzaras, but it was something. It's something that could develop into tzaras. And so that person has to quarantine himself away from people for 7 days. Then after 7 days, the Kohen will come and check it again. So, and that's called a mitzora muskar, a locked up mitzora, a quarantine mitzora. And the Mishnah is going to compare the locked up mitzora, who doesn't have definitive tzaras, but apparently it's still something, and the one who's mitzora muchlat, the definitive mitzora. Says the Mishnah, ein bein mitzora muskar la mitzora muchlat. There's no difference between a quarantine mitzora, someone who didn't have definitive tzaras but had something, and he's locked up, he's quarantined for 7 days, he or she, to a mitzora muchlat, a definitive mitzora. The only difference is ela priya uprima. The only difference is that a definitive mitzora, once a person is declared that he has tzaras, he has to let his hair grow wild, that's priya, and prima, he has to rend his garments. So that's the only difference, meaning a definite mitzora needs to do those things. And a quarantine mitzora doesn't need to do priya or prima, does not need to let his hair grow and rend his garments. That's number one of the Mishnah. Then the Mishnah says, ein bein tahor mitoch hesker l'tahor mitoch hechlet el tiglachas v'tziporim. Now in terms of the purification process and what happens after, so the Mishnah says there's no difference between if a person had definitive tzaras or if they were a mitzora muskar, they were just a quarantine mitzora. There's no difference except tiglachas v'tziporim. That tiglachas is shaving. That the definite mitzora, who before we said has to let his hair grow, well, once he is beginning his purification process, he has to shave off all his hair, and that's part of the purification. And also, there's a special carbon involving two birds, or really, I don't know, carbon. It's a process involving two birds with taking the blood of one and dipping the other one in, and there's a process that the Torah describes. So fine. So that's the only difference, that is required for a mitzora, one who was a mitzora muchlat when he's now purifying himself, if he was a definite mitzora, but not for a mitzora muskar, not for a quarantine mitzora. But everything else, the implication is the same. So that's the Gemara's inference. Says the Gemara, Haleng in shiluach v'tuma zeh v'zeh shavin. So it would seem that with regards to being expelled from the camp or from the city, they're the same. That even though the Torah never says explicitly that a mitzora muskar, a quarantine mitzora, that he's actually muskar, he's quarantined outside the camp, you might think he's just quarantining his house, but the implication of our Mishnah, by saying that the only difference is other things and not shiluach, it sounds like they both have shiluach, they both get sent out. and tuma, and also tuma, that someone with saras is tame, and they make things tame, and it seems that even a mitzora muskar, even a non-definite mitzora, even a quarantine mitzora also is actually tame and makes things tame. That's the implication of our Mishnah, haling in shiluch v'tuma zev is a shavah, in terms of being sent out and making things tame, and being tame and making things tame, they are equal. Ask the Gemara, minaha nimili, what would be the source for that? Because again, it doesn't actually say by a locked up mitzora that you get sent out, or that he's tame and makes things tame. So says the Gemara, the Tanya of Shmuel bar Yitzchak Hamed Rav Huna. Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said before Rav Huna, the pasuk says, "V'tiaro hakohen mispachasi." So this is the guy who was quarantined. When the Kohen comes back to check it 7 days later, so if he checks it and he sees that actually it changed towards the pasuk. The language of the pasuk is keha nega, but it's a question of what that means. But it changed in such a way that it's not a problem anymore. So the pasuk says v'tiaro hakohen, the Kohen will purify him or declare him pure. Mispachasi, it's just a mispachas, it's just a scab. V'chibes bigadav v'taher, and he should wash his clothes, and he is tameh. He is tahor. He is currently tahor. So the Gemara says Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak to Rav Huna, in front of Rav Huna, that the word v'taher is in present tense. He is currently tahor. Now, if it was saying that from here on he's going to be tahor, let me just backtrack for 1 second. When the Gemara asked me, Mili, from where do we know this? It was actually going on the Mishnah. How do we know that a mitzora muskar, a quarantine mitzora, doesn't need prio prima, doesn't need to let his hair grow or rend his clothes? That's what it's coming to address, and it's telling us because it says that when they check him and now he's fine, it says vit taher. It says in the present he is pure. Now, if it was talking about that from here on out he's pure, then it should have said v'yit taher, he'll be pure. But vit taher means like right now he's already pure from something. So says the Gemara that what it's telling you is tahor mi prio prima de meikara, that he is pure from the requirement, from the original requirement of prio prima, meaning he never needed the he never needed prio prima the whole time. He never needed to let his hair grow or rend his clothes. He's been pure from that the whole time. That's what vit taher in the present means. He is pure from that. The way Rashi says it is kvar kodem tvila haya tahar mimiktas tuma. The implication is already before he immersed, he was tahar. And what was he tahar from? What did not apply to him? What was he pure from? What didn't apply? It's prio prima. He didn't have to let his hair grow or rend his clothes. Amar le Rava. Now Rava said to him, Ela me'ata. So if that's true, that when it says vit taher in the present, it means that the whole time he's been pure from something and something hasn't applied to him. So gabe zav dichsev. What about by a zav? We talked about zav on the last Amud, actually, and further up this Amud. What about a zav? A zav, a man who's seen these special emissions that render him tameh. So dichsev, by him it says v'chibes bigadav v'taher. He should wash his clothes v'taher, and then he'll now be pure. But again, if v'taher implies he's been pure the whole time from something, hasamai v'taher mekarika. What does it mean over there? What has he been pure from the whole time as a zav? So there's nothing to say that, the whole time he's been pure from X. So therefore, Rava says you can't, that drasha can't be true. It can't work to say that vit taher implies that you've been pure from something the whole time. So what does vit taher mean? Ela tahar hashta mit latame kli cheres beheset. Afal gav Dahadar chazi lo metame lemafreya. You know what it means in the context of zav? What it means is that a zav, so a zav makes things tameh, beheset, by moving them. Even a kli chares, even an earthenware vessel, if he moves it, he makes it tameh. So now this zav, let's say he saw for one day, and and then he's there's no more emissions that are happening, so he's supposed to count 7 clean days. So this pasuk says when he becomes pure of his emissions, he should count 7 days. Then he should wash his clothes, go to the mikvah, and he is pure. So what does it mean he is pure? So Rava's saying what it means is he's now pure, even if he would see again, but if he, in the meanwhile, he touched or moved things, they would not become tameh lemafreya retroactively. At this point, even though, the way Rashi presents it is, he's counted 7 clean days, and he goes to the mikvah on the 7th day. It's still the 7th day, so he's allowed to go, midoraisa, he's allowed to go to the mikvah on that 7th day. But if he then ends up having an emission before the end of the day, that would ruin the whole count of 7 clean days. So, but let's say he went to the mikvah, and then he moved something, and then he saw having emission. So that thing that he moved after he went to the mikvah, is it tameh or not? So this drasha would be telling me, no, vid taher, that he's tahor, that, and he won't, and even though if he sees again, it kind of ruins the whole thing, but for now, for the meanwhile, he's tahor. And if he moved something, it wouldn't be tameh. So again, vid taher will tell you, on the 7th day he can go in the mikvah, and he's pure, but it's kind of tentative, because if he sees again, that ruins the count, because it's still the 7th day. But during that window, after he went to the mikvah, if he would move something, it wouldn't become tameh. That's what vid taher is teaching you. That's by the zav, says Rava. So now, hachanami, so here too, when it comes to the mitzorah, where we also have the word vid taher, so it says that the Kohen will purify him, it's just a scab, he should wash his clothes, vid taher. So what it's telling you is tahar hashta nilatame bevia lemafreya. He's pure now from making things tameh with bia, with entering into a room. So a mitzorah, if he enters a room, he can make the things that are in that room tameh. The way Rashi says it is the things that he brings in. I think he even makes things in the room tameh. So this guy, he had some kind of lesion, and he got quarantined, and then the Kohen came back and he checked it, and it was fine. It didn't look like anything in the end. So the Kohen said, "You're fine, vid taher, you're fine." So this guy goes into a house with all sorts of kalim and stuff, which if he was a mitzorah, he would make them tameh. But the Kohen said he's not. The Kohen said he's fine. And then, shortly after that, he got a new blemish in that spot. So are those things that he brought in during that window, are they tameh or not? After he had been declared tahor. So this would be telling you that they're not. That we wouldn't render that, even though in the end, shortly after this wound, this lesion became tsaras, it did develop into tsaras in the end, but so now he'll be tameh. But things that he came in contact with or he brought into a house before, he won't make them tameh. So that's what it's coming to tell you. when it says vitaher, that he's right now he's tahor, is that he won't render things tameh retroactively if it turns out in the end that things go downhill, and this tzaras, this questionable tzaras, which when the Kohen checked it was fine, ends up developing into real tzaras, but he won't make things tameh retroactively. Okay, so that's what Rava does with vitaer. So now we're back to our problem, our question. How does the Mishnah know? What's the source for the idea that a quarantined mitzorah does not need to let his hair grow or rend his clothes? And again, the Torah doesn't say that he does, but you might think to just assume, you might assume that it's the same as the definite mitzorahs, because there are a number of things that are the same, so you might think that this is also the same. So Elamar Rabba Mehacha. So Rabba says the source is from the following. It says Vatsarua Asher Bo Hanega. It says, who is the one? This is the pasuk that describes that it says Bigadav Yiyu Frumim, that is his clothes should be rended, and Rosho Yefarua, his hair should grow wild. So who does it say that about, though? The pasuk says, V'hatzarua asher bo hanega. The tzarua, the mitzorah, who the nega, the blemish is on him. So what do we learn from there? Says Rava, that this pasuk is only talking about mishetzarato tiluya begufo. We're talking about someone whose state of tzaras is completely dependent on their body and the state of their body. Meaning, a definite mitzorah, he had a real tzaras blemish. In order to become pure, that real tzaras blemish has to go away. It's dependent on his body for him to become pure, completely. But yatsa zeh, as opposed to a locked up mitzorah, she'ein tzarato tluya begufo ela biyam. His tzaras is not dependent only on his body. It could also be dependent on just time. How so? How is it dependent on time? So, because the way it works is the Kohen, again, he had some kind of blemish. He called the Kohen. The Kohen looked at it. It wasn't clear if it was tzaras or not. Kohen said, we're going to lock you up for 7 days, and we'll check it again. So the Kohen comes, and he checks it again 7 days later. Now let's say, let's say it stays it's the same as it was. It didn't get worse, but didn't get better. So do we lock him up another 7 days? So I think actually there's a change in this Rashi. Yeah. So it 1 second. Yeah. So after we don't lock him up another 7 days. If it didn't get worse, then we just leave him. We let him go. He's off the hook. It's only if it gets worse that he becomes a mitzorah. But if it stays the same, then he's considered pure. So his tzaras is not dependent on his body, because it doesn't have to get better for him to be not a mitzorah, to become pure. It just can't get worse. So it could be just dependent on time. So when he's just a muska, when he's just a quarantined mitzorah. So the pasuk saying that tzaru asher bo hanega, a mitzorah who on his body is the negas, on his body is a blemish, and the Gemara is learning, Rav is saying, what it's telling you is the tzarua, the mitzorah, the one who has tzaras, whose tzaras is dependent on his body, that's a definite mitzorah, that's the one that the pasuk goes on and says, Begadav yufrumim, his clothes should be rended, and his hair should be allowed to grow wild. But a mitzorah who's not dependent on his body, but he's dependent on time, which is the quarantine mitzorah, that as long as it doesn't get worse, even if it stays the same, if the time passes, he becomes pure. So, or he's no longer considered mitzorah. So this pasuk does not apply to him because it's not dependent on his body. So the Gemara asks, Amar le Abaye. So Abaye said to Rava, so if that's what you learned from the words Asher Bo Hanega, it means that the tzaras is dependent on his body. So El Me'ata, the pasuk that says Kol Yemei Asher Hanega Bo Yitma, it says that all the days that the nega is on him, he should be tameh. So who is that talking about? We should say Mishet Tzarato Tuya Begufo Hu Detam Shiluach. That's the pasuk that says it says all the days that the nega, the blemish is on him, he'll be tameh. Badad Yeshev Michutz Lamachane Moshe. He has to sit alone outside the camp. So that's the pasuk that talks about being expelled from the camp or from the city. But it says Asher Bo Hanega. It says the same, or it says Asher Hanega Bo, the one who has the nega on him, so who has a blemish on him. So says Abaye, we should say the same thing. We should say that it's only for somebody Mishet Tzarato Tuya Begufo. It's only someone whose tzaras is dependent on their body. Hu detam shiluach. That's who should require being sent out. V'she'ein tzarato tuya begufa. But if your tzaras is not dependent on your body, and it's dependent on time, meaning a mitzora muskar, a quarantine mitzora, ein tam shiluach. He shouldn't need to be sent out of the camp. Now v'chitema hachinami. Now you might tell me, yeah, you're right. It never says that he has to get sent out of the camp. But it doesn't seem that our Mishnah holds that way. Our Mishnah says, "Ein bing mitzara muskar mitzara mochot." It says the only difference between a quarantine mitzara and a definitive mitzara is ela prio prima. It's only with regards to rending, to letting your hair grow wild and rending your clothes. Halang in shiluach. The implication is, but in terms of shiluach, in terms of being sent out, this was the Gemara's first inference. In terms of being sent out of the camp, and making things tameh by just entering a room, they're equal. Even a mitzora muskar, a quarantined mitzora, should it would apply to. So says Abaye, if you think that when it says Asher Bo Hanega or Asher Nega Bo, it means that only a mitzora muchot, only one who their blemish is, or their status as a mitzora is dependent on this exact state of their body, but not on time. So then it would come out that we would be excluding even from being expelled from the camp, we would be excluding the mitzora muskar, the quarantine mitzora, but that doesn't fit with the Mishnah. So Amar Lei, so Rava said back, Yemei kol yemei. L'rabos mitzara muskar l'shiluach. No, there's an extra word in this pasuk, and the extra word in this pasuk comes to include even a quarantine mitzara, because it says kol yemei asher nega bo yitma. All the days that the nega is on him, he should become tameh. Now it didn't have to say the word kol, all the days, so it should have just said yemei. The days that the nega, the days that he has the blemish, he's tameh. Why did it say kol yemei, all the days? So it's coming to include something. So Rav is saying it's coming to include, I guess this is how he's doing it, all the days, meaning for all people. Not just for a mitzora muchot, not just for the definitive mitzora, but even for the mitzora muskar, the quarantine mitzora, even he gets sent out of the camp. Okay, says the Gemara. Fine, actually, I think there's different girsas, different ways to read the Gemara, but we're going to call that a period. And we're not going to read the word ihachi. And we're going to say that this is now continuing with the discussion from the Mishnah, or the inference. No, the end of the Mishnah. The end of the Mishnah said, Tiglachas vitziparim, right? That there's another difference between a quarantine mitzara and a locked up mitzara, and that is that the quarantine those are the same. There's another difference between the quarantine mitzara / locked up mitzara, the mitzara muskar, and the mitzara muchot, the definitive mitzara, and that is tiglachas v'tziporim, that the definitive mitzora has to shave his body as part of his purification process and go through the service involving the birds. So my time olo. So why does that not apply to a mitzora muskar. Why does he not have to do it? Diktani, that we're able to say in the Mishnah, that the Mishnah says that there's no difference between them except for shaving one's body and birds. That's only for a definitive mitzvah, not a mitzvah muskar, not a quarantine mitzvah. So where's that from? So Amar Abaye says Amar Kra, because the pasuk says V'yatza kol yom michutz lamachaneh, and the Kohen should go out to outside the camp. V'nei nirpa nega tzaras, and behold, the nega tzaras, the tzaras blemish has been healed. Then that pasuk goes on to say, or the next pasuk, that he has to then go through the process of shaving his body and the birds. So who does this apply to? So says Abaye, Mishetzarato tuya b'refuos, Yatzazesh ein tzarato tuya b'refuos ala b'yamim. This applies. It says v'nir pa. It says the one who their tzaras is healed. So it applies to only one who needs their tzaras to heal. Who needs their tzaras to heal? The one who has definitive tzaras. The one who has only questionable tzaras, they don't need their tzaras to heal. It just can't get worse. But it's dependent on days only. If the 7 days elapse and the tzaras didn't get worse, so then they're fine, even though it didn't heal. So it's not dependent on healing. So therefore, this pasuk doesn't apply to them. This requirement and the requirement of shaving one's hair and the birds is only for one whose tzaras is dependent on healing, meaning a mitzora muchlat, a definitive mitzora. Okay, next Mishnah. Next Mishnah says, Ein bein svarim l'tfilin u'mezuzos. There's no difference between svarim. Svarim here means the books of Tanakh. And what we mean is the laws of how you write them on parchment. There's no difference between writing a sefer of Tanakh and tefillin and mezuzos, and the scrolls of tefillin and the scrolls, the mezuzah scroll. The only difference is that you're allowed to write the books of Tanakh in any language, and they could still have kedusha. They could still be considered a holy book. But tefillin and mezuzos are only allowed to be written in ashuris, in the Hebrew font that we use for our tefillin mezuzos and sifrei Torah, called ashuris. So all the laws applying to sifrei kodesh are the same, whether it's scrolls of Torah or Tanakh, and or it's scrolls of tefillin and mezuzos, except, or at least for the writing them, except that the Tanakh scrolls can be written in any language, and the and tefillin mezuzos have to be written in ashuris. Rashi says by ashuris we actually mean lashon hakodesh. They have to be written in Hebrew. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, af besfarim lo yitir sheyichtavu al yavanis. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says no. Even Tanakh cannot be written in any language. There's one other language they could be written in, and that is Yavanis, Greek. Greek has a special status, but they cannot be written in English or any other language other than Hebrew and Greek. That's the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So the Tanakama, the first Tana of the Mishnah, holds that other than tefillin and mezuzos, the Sfarim of Tanakh can be written in any language, and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says no, they can only be written in Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew, or in Greek. Says the Gemara. So if those are the only differences between Sifrei Kodesh, holy books, and Tefillin and mezuzos, so halatofrim begidin, l'tamis yadayim zeh v'zeh shaven. So it would seem that in terms of the requirement to sew them together with gidin, with sinews, they're the same. They all require that. And also, the Tamas Yadayim, they would make one's hands tameh if they touch the scrolls, and one would have to wash their hands after. For that, they are equal. Fine. So now the Gemara is going to examine the statement that Sfarim can be written in any language. That the Sifrei Tanakh, the books of Tanakh, can be written in any language. V'raminu, we ask a contradiction from a Brisa. The Brisa says, Mikra shekasvo targum. If you write Mikra, Psukim, verses of Tanakh, and you write it in Targum, you write it in Aramaic, the Targum, or any translation, actually specifically Aramaic, you write, I think, the Aramaic translation, the Targum shekasvo mikra, or here and there is a word in the Torah that's Aramaic. If you write it in Mikra, you write it in Hebrew, you translate it into Hebrew, uksav ivri, and also you don't use Ashuris, use ksav ivri. Ksav ivri is an old Hebrew font, text. So, eino metames yadayim. It won't make your hands tummy, meaning it won't have the status of Sifrei Kodesh. If you write Mikra, you write Hebrew psukim in Aramaic or in a translation, so it's not it doesn't have the status of Sifrei Kodesh, and it doesn't make your hands tameh. Ad sheyichtaveno b'ksav ashuris ala sefer uvadio. Until you write it with ksav ashuris, with the ashuris font, and I think, and also, like Rashi said before, seemingly lashon hakodesh, ala sefer, on a scroll, uvidio, and with ink. So, so we have a contradiction. Our Mishnah says that the Sifrei Kodesh, that Sifrei Tanakh can be written in any language, and this Brisa says that you can't write Mikra in Targum. You can't write Psukim with their Aramaic translation. You have to write them with Ksav Ashuris, with the Ashuris text, again, which is what we use to write our Sifrei Torah and Tefillin and Mezuzos, ala sefer, on a scroll, and with ink. So, okay, so which one is it? Can you write them in a translation or not? So, Amar Rava, so Rava says, lo kashya, it's not a contradiction. Kan begufan shalanu, kan begufan shalahen. You can write it in a translation, but you can't use other letters, other letter forms, other languages. So if you write it in our Hebrew and Ashuris, so then you can write it in any language. So you write, like, let's say, Bereshis, in Aleph Yud Nun, the, Tes, Taf, Hey, however you want to spell it, beginning, but you write it with Hebrew text, so then that's what the Mishnah says, you can write in any language. But the text, the ksiva, has to be in our Hebrew font, text. Then it's okay. But when the Brisa said it's no good, that was, and that you need to write in Ksav Ashuris, that was saying you can't write it in, you can write the translation, but it has to be done in our text. Abaye said to him, so what are you saying the case is of the Brisa, where it says it's no good? You're telling me it's begufan shalahen. You're telling me that the case is you wrote the translation, but you wrote it begufan shalahen, you used their letters. So then ma'ir yam mikra shekasvu targum, saying, why does it bother speaking about where you took a Hebrew line of the Torah and you wrote it in Targum, you wrote it in Aramaic, the Targum shekasvu mikra, or you took an Aramaic one and you translate it into Hebrew. You don't need to talk about where you translate it. Afilu mikra shekasvu mikra, the Targum shekasvu targum. Even if you wrote in the correct language, nami, it should also be a problem if you used a different font, a different text. language. I'm sure there's a word for it, I just can't think of it. If you used English letters, so that would also be a problem. It says you have to write in Ashuris on a scroll, and with ink it has to be in Ashuris. So Abaye is questioning Rava's resolution. Rava had said, how do we resolve the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Brisa? The Mishnah says you can write it in any language. The Brisa says you can't. So Rava said the Mishnah is talking about where you used Hebrew text. Then you can write it in any language. The Brisa is talking about where you didn't. And that's why it's a problem, and you have to use Ksav Ashuris. So Abaye says, well, if that's what's going on, if you're using a different text, so then why did it speak about a case where you wrote a Hebrew pasuk in Aramaic, or an Aramaic pasuk in Hebrew? Even if you wrote a Hebrew pasuk in Hebrew, but you used a different font, and you wrote again Bereshis, Bereishis, so that would also be a problem. It's not because you translated that's a problem. It's because you used a different font that it's a problem, a different text. So that can't be the resolution. Ella, one final line here. So rather, Abaye has a different resolution than the Gemara has. Ella lo kashya. It's not a contradiction. Harabanan harabi Shimon Gamliel. Our Mishnah is the opinion of the Rabbanan. The Bryce is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, right? Because at the end of our Mishnah, we actually met Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's opinion. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, no, you can't write Svarim in any language. You can only write them in Hebrew and in Greek, but no other language. So when the Brisa says that if you write Mikra in Targum, you write Hebrew into Aramaic, that it's a problem. That's because Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who holds that you're not allowed to translate into other languages. You only are allowed to translate, or in order to have the status of Sifrei Kodesh, of holy books, holy works, it has to be written in either Hebrew or Greek, but no other language would grant it still the status of Sifrei Kodesh, of holy works. And so that's our current resolution. The Gemara is going to continue to question this, but that the Mishnah is the opinion, the Tanakama is the Rabbanan, and the Brisa, which argues, is like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who was in the end of the Mishnah, who said that you cannot write Sfarim in any language, only in Hebrew or Greek. Okay, we'll hold here.